Get comfy, son. We're going to go for a little drive.
Mr. Regan.
What's this?
That's all there is, I'm afraid.
What have you moles been doing in here?
It's been slow, I told you that.
What cut have you taken for yourself?
Nothing. I've paid the girls, I haven't taken my wage out yet.
Looks like you're going to miss out again.
No way, I've got bills to pay.
I'm running around, busting my guts, trying to do my best for this business, and you're sitting on your dumb slut freckle doing nothing. If I wasn't so busy, I'll give you a real hiding. Pull your finger out! You know what they call me? They call me the magician. You want to know why? I'm the magician because I make people disappear. And guess what, son? You're going to be part of the act. It's all right, mate. You don't have to do anything. I got this down pat now. I've been making people disappear since I was 19. The only trouble is, I haven't figured out how to bring them back.
Meet Stewart John Regan, gangster, pimp, multiple murderer and psychopath. Tonight we separate fact from fiction and examine the life of Stewart John Regan, the magician. Regan was a dangerous, vicious criminal who killed multiple times. Many of his victims simply vanished off the face of the earth. Regan enjoyed inflicting pain and was considered a psychopath. He attacked indiscriminately, taunted police, and even killed a young child in cold blood. Tonight, through dramatised scenes, first-hand accounts and detailed analysis, we paint a portrait of a violent criminal who revelled in his reputation as the most ruthless and feared man in the Sydney underworld.
He was the Houdini of homicide, if you like, the Merlin of murder. He just destroyed people and had no hesitation in carving people up whenever he wanted to get rid of someone.
He was one of the worst human beings that ever walked the streets of Sydney. He was a child murderer, he was a psychopath. He was just a horrible human being who ultimately got his just desserts.
There is no doubt that he was a psychopath.
We'll stop working when I tell you you can stop working.
He was just a vicious, violent man.
For some of the criminals, murder is the last resort. For Regan, it was the first port of call.
From a young age, Regan enjoyed the suffering of others. As a child, he tortured and killed animals for pleasure, and by his teens, he was using brutal violence to control prostitutes in Sydney's red light districts. Regan attacked his rivals, raped and bashed the prostitutes he controlled, and killed repeatedly. His fearsome reputation also meant few would stand in his way, afraid of being banished by the magician.
John Regan earned the nickname the Magician, and it had nothing to do with his prestigious abilities. People who befriended John Regan tended to disappear, thus he was called the Magician.
The nickname arose out of the fact that several people that he'd had dealings with disappeared, never to be seen again. And the fact that he was never ever charged in any way in connection with those people.
He relished having this reputation. He gloried in it. He loved everyone to hate him and to have this absolute fear of him.
The police that I spoke to at the time figured that he'd done at least 8 murders. Now, there may well have been more. Nobody bar Regan really knew that. The police knew of at least 8 people who were friends of Regan's or cohorts of Regan's who disappeared. And Regan knew that everyone knew that he made these people disappear.
Psychologist Janet Hall believes that, just like a real magician, Regan would have practiced his macabre skills and found satisfaction in what he did.
I reckon he would have absolutely enjoyed being called the Magician. It would have made him feel special, empowered, and also fed his ego in terms of, you know, well, there were no boundaries.
If you look at the profile of a sadist, as someone who likes to be in charge, who likes to be in control. So if he's got a name which gives him that identity, that fits very nicely with his psychological makeup, his sense of self. That's what I'm known as.
They call me the magician.
It's part and parcel of his capacity to inspire fear in others to get his own way. The other thing about it is these guys are pretty narcissistic. They really like themselves. They don't like anybody else, but they really like themselves. And so, yeah, this kind of stuff, when he gets nicknamed and he's been given special powers and all that kind of stuff, that'd be really feeding his ego something fierce.
Regan's reputation as a psychopath meant that as he carved out a criminal empire and started taking over legitimate businesses, he met little resistance. By his mid-20s, he was running large numbers of prostitutes, owned a couple of women's dress shops, and was expanding into real estate, car rebirthing and TV rentals.
John Regan started off just as a violent street hood. And of course, from Paddington, he gravitated to King's Cross, to the Darlinghurst area, where illegal gambling, prostitution proliferated. Men and women feared him. And in fact, some of the heaviest gangsters in Sydney at the time were very wary of John Regan.
Well, he's such a psychopath that he would maim and injure people, including the females that he controlled.
No way, I've got bills to pay.
Both the police and the criminals themselves were in great fear of a man whose behaviour was totally unpredictable, but was always violent.
He grew up with this violent streak, vicious streak, and it got worse as he got older.
He was a real stand-over man, and as I said, a real psychopath. He was mad.
Of all the criminals I ever knew or dealt with as a crime reporter, Regan would probably have been the most vicious and deadly of the lot. The most heartless.
If I wasn't so busy, I'll give you a real hiding. Pull your finger out!
Regan was born in 1945 in the New South Wales town of Young. An only child, his mother Claire thought him strong-willed, while he in turn called her the Colonel, a nickname that maybe hints that discipline was an issue. Regan struggled at school and his mother blamed him for expecting things to fall into his lap. But according to our investigations, there were darker factors at play. From a very early age, Regan was exhibiting some of the classic behaviours of a psychopath.
His mother and father lived at Young. As I say, a young fella lived at Young. And there he was known to perform evil tricks on animals. And his father was a pretty rough old shearer.
Regan, as a young kid, was always on the way to becoming a criminal. He displayed the tendencies of violence and viciousness even when he was a young juvenile.
Well, he would get dogs and cats, small ones and kittens and puppies, and torture them to his own satisfaction, then kill them.
Psychologists assess men like Regan for the courts and agree that the disturbing behaviour he exhibited as a young child indicated an incredibly troubled mind.
It's often very hard to predict who's going to become a criminal and who isn't. But one of the main indicators is somebody who is cruel to animals. And we're talking about really cruel, things that most little kids wouldn't even dream of doing, and torturing them and getting pleasure out of that torture.
Torturing and or killing pet animals is an early indicator of an expression of inner hostility. Such an individual, as they grow older, will then extend that very same hostility towards not just animals, but to the people around them.
It indicates that as an adult, he's going to get pleasure out of hurting people, out of deliberately causing them pain and making them suffer. And that basically gives him a sense of power and also gets, his jollies. He gets his jollies out of that.
What made Regan's torture and killing of animals even more disturbing was that he enjoyed having an audience for his murderous deeds. It satisfied him on 2 levels, for he could psychologically terrorise the other kids whilst inflicting gruesome and fatal torture on his unfortunate animal victim.
Where'd you get that Stu? Trapped him, little bastard was running around sitting at home. What are you going to do with it? I was going to show you a little magic trick. For my next trick, I'll need a pitchfork. What a coincidence.
Don't hurt it, Stu. It's just a possum.
How about I hurt you instead? Where you going, Joe?
I gotta go to the toilet.
You better stay right there or you're next. Now, before I was rudely interrupted, I was going to show you blokes a little magic trick. Let's pretend the possum in this sack is Joe's face. Everyone got that? Can everyone see Joe's face in this sack here?
It's enough, Stu. It's dead. You're bloody mad, Regan.
Regan was known amongst the people who knew him here in Sydney, amongst police, reporters, as not only a psychopath but a sociopath. No one was surprised to learn that as a child he killed animals, he harmed animals. He just had no empathy for any living being whatsoever.
As a kid, he was killing dogs and cats, sitting back smiling, watching them die. Later on, he actually speared a possum with a pitchfork and watched it die.
It's enough, Stu. It's dead.
He was just something that should have been disposed of before it was ever unleashed on society.
You're bloody mad, Regan.
Forensic psychologist Chris Lennings believes animal torture hints at psychopathy.
There's certainly a link between childhood and early adolescent cruelty to animals and later psychopathic behaviour. So when you see that kind of behaviour occurring, you do start to worry about the extent to which a person just really is psychopathic in intent, violent, aggressive, without moral constraint, and likely to go on to do terrible things.
So the development from doing it to animals to doing it to people just happens naturally as his sense of power does. So as soon as he's grown into a strong enough, big enough body, he can start, pushing other kids around. So it probably would have happened, really just in early primary school, that he would have started bullying people and hurting people.
Part of the whole thing about being a psychopath is that it's not just the powers. You like to inflict pain. You don't have any moral constraint on doing that. You find some means of meeting your needs, pleasure, call it what you will, in being able to do terrible things to animals, to people. That's what a psychopath is. They're a person who utilises brutal force in getting what it is that they want.
Author and journalist Norm Lipson recalls a particular episode illustrating Regan's psychopathic nature.
One time he was upset with somebody who he thought had wronged him. He bashed this fellow to a pulp, put a dog collar on him and a chain, made him go on all fours to the local pub where he belittled him all day, made him sit on all fours like a dog, slapped him around, shoved raw meat in his mouth just because he thought he'd been wronged by this fellow.
People who have psychopathy are extremely antisocial. They have their own set of rules which are grounded on their own experience and value systems, and those value systems and rules that they live by often bear no resemblance to the ones that you and I are supposed to live by. And I suppose to get to the top of the food chain, you need a certain level of focus. And psychopaths have this kind of focus. They're ambitious, their families come second, third and fourth, and they do the job that they have to do to the best of their ability, and that's their value system.
Regan's parents divorced when he was young and he moved to Sydney with his mother. Here he progressed from hurting animals to inflicting pain on people. By his early teens, he was attacking strangers in the street, and aged just 14, he was sent to the brutal Gosford Reformatory. There he met other up-and-coming criminals, including future murderer Arthur Neddy Smith, who described Regan as having the coldest eyes he had ever seen. Psychologists agree that children incarcerated so young inevitably have their development affected by the experience.
So in psychology, we talk about how people learn to be the people they are. And so we learn through modelling, that is copying others. The other way we learn is in response to our environment or what happens to us. So if somebody's been abused, violated, punished, they learn that perhaps that's something that makes you feel bad, but it gives you a sense of power to inflict it on somebody else.
Especially in places like Gosford Boys Home, not only were they not being given the pro-social kinds of skills that they needed, but they're also being exposed to really antisocial influences, not just from their peers, but also from the people who were in authority, the people who should have been providing deterrence or the correction that was, hopefully gained by placing them there in the first place.
Regan served 9 months in Gosford, but instead of returning to school on his release, he focused on his criminal career and, while still a teenager, made his move into pimping.
Amazingly, at 17, Regan totes up his first conviction for living off the earnings of prostitution. He's a person who, because he's not very smart, but he is so violent and unpredictable, is immediately feared by madams who run suburban brothels in Sydney. He literally arrives at the door of some of these places and demands standover money, and the madams who are already paying standover money elsewhere quickly find that the protection they thought they had doesn't exist, because a lot of the criminals who are in the world supposedly providing standover do not want to deal with Regan.
Regan was a man who inspired fear wherever he went. As Neddy Smith, who was incarcerated with Regan at Gosford, would later write, Regan had always wanted to join the army so he could kill people with no questions asked. But he had been rejected. Unable to satisfy his bloodlust through legal means, Regan unleashed his own personal war on the streets of Sydney and on the prostitutes the 17-year-old Pimp controlled.
So who do we have here?
This is Mandy, Mr. Regan. The new girl?
Where you from, Mandy?
I live in Paddington.
Give her the drum on the rates?
Yes, Mr. Regan.
It's not your job, is it?
No, Mr. Regan.
Whose job is it, Sherelle?
Yours, Mr. Regan.
Good girl. You're a good-looking filly. Won't stay that way forever, but while you are, can make us both a good quid. Rule number 1, I'm the fucking boss, and what I say goes. Got a problem with a punter, or you get knocked up, you come tell me. I'll sort you.
Yes, Mr. Regan.
The house gets 60, you get 40. Special rate just for you. Then we renegotiate.
Yes, Mr. Regan.
And a bit of free advice? When I put these gloves on, make yourself scarce.
Yes, Mr. Regan.
Now, come and show me what you're good at.
Around the areas of Darlinghurst and the Cross, around the brothel-type areas and the suburban pubs, he was known then as a basher and a sort of a guy who would, if you upset him, you ran the risk of him going to kill you.
John Regan built up a stable of prostitutes. He made quite a lot of money out of that, and he controlled them through fear and violence. If they didn't hand over as much money as he thought they should have, he slapped them around. If he found out that there was a customer who was misbehaving or wasn't paying, they'd be beaten within an inch of their lives.
He had no feelings for anybody, be it female or male. They were just there as items for him to use, abuse if he had to, and make money out of it.
John Regan wouldn't care where he'd discipline his prostitutes. If he had to do it in the street in the middle of King's Cross, he'd do it. He was vicious. He'd make an example of one, and then the others would fall into line. Simple as that.
Regan's cruelty and violence towards women as a teenage pimp echoed his callous torture of animals as a child.
That's part of that sadistic profile, that humiliation, that control, that domination, which fits that whole profile of disempowering women and him being empowered. And that's part of that pimping process.
When you study psychology, sometimes we talk about how they basically have no sense of soul, and it's all about using a body to make money, and that body better do as it's told.
He'll use whatever means necessary. There'll be the development of fear, the threat of violence, there'll be exploitation through drug use. There essentially will be trapping people to do what he wants to do. But he'll revert to the use of force fairly quickly if there's any opposition.
Regan's violence also extended to friends, associates and random victims.
John Regan would bash people in the street as soon as look at them. I've heard many stories of Regan bashing people, stubbing cigarettes, lit cigarettes in their faces.
Regan was a dangerous man. Regan had always been a dangerous man. Regan was known to be a dangerous man for his own particular ends. He made associations to suit himself. He ended associations to suit himself. He killed his peers, he killed his rivals, he killed anyone and hurt anyone who got in his way. Regan was a significantly unattractive man in gangster terms.
I remember a story about Regan being in King's Cross with a friend, and he'd come across somebody he'd had a disagreement with, bashed him to a pulp, and as the guy lay on the ground, mortally wounded, Regan turned to his friend who was smoking a cigarette, made him give him the cigarette, and he stubbed that lit cigarette in the person's eye. That's how vicious Regan was.
By his early 20s, Regan had made a name for himself as a brutal and violent pimp. He was also racking up a substantial police record with charges for assault, robbery and rape. With the money rolling in, Regan expanded his empire, buying property, opening a couple of women's dress shops and running car rebirthing scams. But Regan was a very dangerous man to do business with.
Of all people, John Regan actually opened a woman's boutique in Double Bay, selling women's clothes, frocks, the latest styles. And a very famous crime reporter at the time, who worked for the Daily Mirror newspaper, called Bill Jenkins, wrote a story about that boutique and intimated that Regan was selling stolen goods from that boutique. Well, that really angered John Regan, and he told reporters that he was going to kill Bill Jenkins. Now, Bill spoke to me about that. Bill feared for his life, he feared for his family's lives, and for Bill to be frightened was a rare event. Luckily for Bill, Regan disappeared before he could do anything to Bill.
One of Regan's business partners was standover man and brothel manager Big Barry Flock. Early in 1967, Regan and Flock fell out over $800. Small change to a man like Regan, but enough to kill for.
One of the early murders by Regan was the fellow called Barry Flock. Now, he was also a pimp.
Regan became involved with him, and the two of them invested in a ladies' dress shop across the road from a brothel in Bondi Junction. There was a dispute about an amount of money, $800.
And his body was just found in the grounds of a hospital. No real indication of who it was, except the underworld was totally convinced it was Regan.
The police know that Regan was involved in it, and this is a classic falling out of somebody who, 2 days earlier, is in partnership with Regan.
Flock's body was discovered in the grounds of the Scottish Hospital in Paddington. He'd been shot 4 times. Regan was brought in for questioning, but without any proof, police were unable to press charges. Regan's war on Sydney had begun.
There were 4 early murders, all were pimps, and they all just went.
He got away with a hell of a lot. He got away with at least 6 or 8 murders, and the police could never prove it. But the police were always after him, always hassling him, always on his back, always following him, and Regan didn't like that.
Allegations of assault, perverting the course of justice, burglary and other charges just fell by the wayside simply because you couldn't find witnesses who testified. They were too scared of him.
Regan was drawing a lot of police attention, but covered his tracks carefully, and despite being linked to a number of murders, he remained free. But even murder couldn't satisfy Regan's bloodlust. His need for violence was so overwhelming, it started becoming ritualised, with overtones of a sexual fetish.
Regan used to love to wear leather gloves, black leather gloves, and when he felt in the mood that he was going to get into a fight, and it wouldn't matter who it was, he'd pick somebody at random, he'd put these gloves on and just pick somebody and start belting them.
He embraced violence like an old friend. He loved it, but he would need to get himself going to such an extent he would go out and at random just bash people anonymously in the street just for thrills.
That's the sort of fella Regan was. I mean, it could have been your grandfather. Regan wouldn't care. He'd king hit your grandfather.
One of the really dangerous aspects of Regan was that, even quite young, he saw that violating somebody and really causing them harm was fun. It was a sport. And in wearing, black gloves, there is some kind of sexual fetish. It's a real turn-on to use that power of surprise, attack and pain. He would have gotten really, excited by that in a way that perhaps somebody else would have with their, their first love.
With the underworld afraid to take him on and the cops unable to charge him, Regan ran amok on the streets of Sydney, killing and bashing at will. There was only one man Regan ever deferred to, the only man brave enough to teach him a bit of respect.
Oi. You, Regan.
The bloke had a tumble. Fell over. Just like that. Nothing to do with me.
You king-hitting piece of shit.
What's it got to do with you, Mackey?
That's Detective Sergeant Gil Mackey to you, boy, and you're under arrest.
You didn't see nothing.
Yeah, I did. And so did our little mate having a snooze here.
I reckon by the time this goes to court, this fella's going to have a change of heart about getting in the box.
You think you got it all sorted out, don't you?
Your words, not mine.
Why don't I take you back to the cells and I'll see if I'll sort you out a bit more back there, eh? What do you reckon?
Don't you lose that fucking badge, you pig! See how you get on here and now.
Consider it done. I'll tell you what. I'll even let you get the first one in.
You know I know you won't charge me, copper.
Scout's honour. You just go your hardest, boy. Right then. Now, if I ever see you around here again, I'm going to give you another hiding that's going to make this blue seem like a fucking pillow fight. You got that? Am I making myself clear to you now? Yes. I'm not a fucking sir, boy. I'm Detective Sergeant Mackey to you.
Detective Sergeant Mackey.
Oh, well, clean yourself up, boy.
Yes, Detective Sergeant.
The interesting thing about Regan is he feared no one. It became almost legendary within the criminal milieu that the only person he ever deferred to was a policeman named Gil Mackey, who at one point ended up taking on Regan physically and gave Regan a beating.
He was in the Australian Army, and we all called him Major. But I don't know whether he attained those heights, but he was a noted and respected member of the armed forces. He was as hard as they come, and he didn't mind a little bit of fisticuffs.
He wasn't scared of Regan. He wasn't scared of anybody, Mackey. And he used to hassle Regan quite a bit, and Regan got upset with him one time, and told him that if he ever wanted to take his badge off, he'd look after him.
Don't you lose that fucking badge, you pig! See how you get on here now.
The sergeant dealt him a bit of summary justice. And as a result, Gil was the only police officer, to my knowledge, that Regan had any respect for at all after that.
Yes, Detective Sergeant Mackey.
Forensic psychologist Chris Lennings has dealt with offenders like Regan, assessing them for the courts.
It's very primitive, isn't it? It's that kind of wolf stuff, you know, you beat me and then you're a leader of the pack kind of stuff. That's a very primitive response. And it surprises me to a certain extent because you would have thought that the primary aspect of the narcissism that underpins someone who's psychopathic is that if you are challenged, then you have this rage and you need to get revenge. So the fact that he falls back into this kind of more primitive deference stuff is quite interesting.
Well, I suppose it's like the psychology of any bully. They're standover men as long as they get away with it. The minute one person stands up to them and puts them down, like Mackey did with Regan, then you defer to that person who put you down.
By his mid-20s, Regan was running a vice empire built on fear and extreme violence. After killing Barry Flock, the magician's murders became more strategic. He knocked off Ross Christie, a partner in his dress shop, then disposed of Eric the Monkey Williams to consolidate his hold on Sydney's brothels. And that wasn't all.
He was involved in somewhere between 6 and 10 murders. 1 minute the criminal is seen, the next minute they're gone. A good example was the criminal Kevin Victor Gore, who was one of the notorious toe cutter gang.
Well, the toe cutters were a gang of Melbourne crooks who used to torture other crooks. So Regan befriended a fellow called Gore, who was one of the toe cutter gang, and Gore disappeared.
He is last seen walking down the street with Johnny Regan. The next day, he's reported missing. He's never seen again.
And I've got no doubt that Regan ended up with Gore's cash.
By the early 1970s, Regan's murderous crime spree and blatant empire building meant he came to the attention of the Team, the feared group of gangsters who ran Sydney's underworld.
Well, by the time he was in his early 20s and running his prostitutes and delving into other areas, he captured the attention of other criminals, including George Freeman, Lenny McPherson, and people who were watching him with a wary eye.
He managed to get himself in the milieu, so to speak, because the gangsters of the time thought it'd better to have him inside the tent than outside the tent.
I remember Lenny McPherson talking to me once about criminals. He said, you can control a bad man, but you can't control a madman. And that's exactly what Stewart John Regan was.
By this point, Regan was considered so mad and so dangerous that the Team's George Freeman, a feared gangster himself, commented that he struck fear into the hearts of everyone he met. Regan revelled in his notoriety, employing bodyguards, carrying a gun and wearing a bulletproof vest. No one was safe, and women who were unlucky enough to attract his attention suffered violence, rape and jealous rages.
If I wasn't so busy, I'll give you a real hiding.
One girlfriend, Helen Scott Huey, suffered perhaps the worst fate of all. On the night of May 22nd, 1974, Helen left her young son, Carlos, in Regan's care while she went to work in a nightclub.
Yeah, but what about Carlos? I can't look after him, I've got to go to work. Well, you promised you'd pick him up and take him. How sick are you? Righto. Yeah, the club will have to do without me. You're hopeless. I can't go in. I've got to look after Carlos.
Bull's fucking ass. You got to get to work. This joint isn't going to pay for itself.
I haven't had a night off with Carlos in months. I need a break.
Get to work. I'll take care of him.
He's just a little boy who needs his mum. I need to feed him. I need to settle him down to sleep.
I said forget it. I'll take care of him. Carlos. What do you want to eat, Carlos?
Ice cream.
There you go. I'll get him an ice cream.
He can't eat ice cream for dinner.
Now, you listen to me. The boy's staying here with me, and you're going to go out and earn some fucking money, got it?
I want to be home with my boy.
You'll stop working when I tell you you can stop working. I said I'll look after your fucking kid. You want to pull the pin? You and the kid are out in the street.
Perhaps the final straw for everyone concerning Regan and his future came in unbelievable circumstances and involving a crime so odious it can't really be believed.
The theory was that Regan, who had a bad temper, was babysitting Carlos while his mother was out working, earning a quid. He somehow killed Carlos. To cover his tracks, he dumped Carlos's body somewhere and then contact the police in a panic to say that someone had taken Carlos.
Regan told police he took Carlos out for only a few minutes and the boy was abducted from his car while Regan bought a newspaper. No one believed him.
Now, the police and the whole underworld had no doubt that Regan had basically lost at some point his legendary temper, killed the boy, he's got rid of the body, but nobody can prove anything. The boy was never seen again. Everybody knows it's to do with Regan's temper.
Well, he's a complete psychopath, and his story was an absolute falsehood. And I have no doubt that he killed the little kid.
In true magician style, Regan's youngest victim simply vanished.
From my point of view, it was a very intensive investigation at the time, which unfortunately came to nothing. Whilst there was great suspicion, the investigating police couldn't get it beyond that.
And no body was found. No bodies were ever found of Regan's victims. So it was hard for the police and everyone to pursue. But obviously it caused a furor among the public. You can't have children disappearing, presumably murdered, and do nothing.
Now, that had really sealed his fate with everyone, with the coppers, with the crooks. To do something like that really was beyond the pale. And even the crooks had a code of honour, and that had broken that code.
Forensic psychologists believe Regan may have killed Carlos because he felt threatened.
The girlfriend's supposed to love him. What would be a threat to that love? Her child. What would a mother generally love more, a boyfriend or their biological child? Typically, we'd say they would love the biological child. Sadists are very egocentric and very narcissistic. It's a very obvious characteristic of these sorts of people. So here is an opportunity to get rid of any threat to his girlfriend's affection towards him.
Some believe Regan did take Carlos out that night, but not for a newspaper.
You know what people call me? Carlos. Listen, they call me the magician. You know why?
Why?
Because I make people disappear. You want to see? Now, you climb in here, give me your ice cream, there you are, and say the magic words.
Abracadabra.
If he was trying to get back at the mother, this was just a very convenient and obvious way of doing it. He would have planned how to get rid of the body. He was good at that. And he would have just done it just like, you know, somebody else might go to the supermarket. He would have no remorse, no shame, no sense of being, you know, basically lowest of the low. It's just what he could do, and he did it.
Regan was a vicious psychopath who since childhood had taken pleasure in the suffering of others. Now under investigation for murder, instead of lying low, he milked his moment of fame, taunting police by pretending to search for Carlos's body and supplying the media with false leads, suggesting Carlos was buried under a house.
I remember, you know, where he put dog bones or something down at the Woolloomooloo, and and said, oh, there's bones there, you know, probably this is where this little bloke is. And he'd do that because that would be his kick, you know, being a psychopath. That would be, he'd be getting a huge amount of fun out of that.
He's inflicting pain by setting out the bones. It's also another way of him laughing, getting the police to run. So it's about also, again, his way of trying to control the community, trying to control people, because that's what he's really become very skilled at.
Part of what he's doing is to set up a system whereby people won't believe that it's him. A part of what he's doing also is letting people know he's taking the mickey out of them. He'd know the difference between a dog bone and a baby bone, and he'd know that they would know the difference between a dog bone and a baby bone. So what he's really doing is just having a go at them.
In 1974, Regan worked his black magic on Carlos, a young child he was babysitting.
They call me the magician. You know why?
Why?
Because I make people disappear.
Carlos's murder drew huge publicity, but without a body, Regan walked free. Everyone knew he was guilty, and with the police unable to act, pressure mounted on Sydney's underworld to do something about him. Plenty of people muttered behind Regan's back, but the only man brave enough to call him a child murderer to his face was Ratty Jack Clark, a fellow Standover man and freelance killer.
Ratty Jack accused John Regan, and he was the first person to do it to his face, accused John Regan of having killed the boy. Well, not long after that, Regan shot Ratty Jack Clark, and that was another reason that John Regan had to go. Ratty Jack Clark was a well-liked man, and that was the final straw.
They decided, whoever they were, this bastard, he's no good for anyone. He's no good for us as criminals. He's no good for the community. He's a danger to everyone. Look at the number of people he's got rid of, including that little kid. It's time we did our job, and I think that's exactly what they did. And good on them, and I'm glad they did it.
Regan had to go, but arranging his murder wasn't going to be easy. Paranoid, he was always armed and wore a bulletproof vest. It would take veteran crime lord Frederick Paddles Anderson, one of the few men Regan trusted, to disarm him so the team could finish the job.
Here he is. How's it going, son?
G'day, Paddles. How's it going, mate?
Big day for you today. Big step up to the big league.
Mate, I've been aiming at this for years, so thanks for setting it up.
No sweat. You're a good boy. Good earner. Everyone's impressed. That's why George is going to show you the ropes. This is rivers of gold, son.
Bring it on. So is George at the club?
Yeah. You can't go there carrying. Shooters scare the shit out of George.
Mate, I'm always carrying.
Well, you can't take it. George will dirty up.
What am I supposed to do with it?
Give it to me. I'll get it back to you. I'm your guardian angel. No one can touch you while I'm your sponsor. What about your ankle? You got a piece there?
Mate, I'm fucking naked.
Look, don't worry. George will set you right. Just listen to him. Listen and learn. You're playing A grade now.
He's waiting for me now.
He's outside the club waiting. Relax. He knows you're with me.
George, mate.
Hello, Johnny.
You're going to show me the ropes at last.
Well, you know, you've been pestering me long enough. I reckon you deserve it.
Ain't that the truth?
First thing I need to do is introduce you to Stan.
Who?
Hello, Johnny. No!
You're next, George.
Five, 6, 7. And this one's for the kid, you fucking piece of shit.
the ultimate say for these things was in the hands of Frederick Charles Paddles Anderson, whose history goes way back. He was the boss of bosses, above the Mr. Biggs and everyone else.
Paddles Anderson, who knew Regan quite well and over a long period of time, and who Regan did trust, and he didn't trust very many people, had arranged a meeting. In fact, it was Paddles Anderson who disarmed Regan before the meeting.
As he walked out of that club onto the street that night, for some reason, there were no cars in that street at that time. They were blocked off on both ends, and a hail of bullets hit Regan.
No!
And you could hear the cheers all over Sydney.
It allowed them to present themselves as responsible gangsters. They were not going to have people who abused children, killed children. That was not on. And it also showed them that they could solve problems that perhaps the police and the politicians couldn't.
Forensic psychologist Sandy Ray believes Regan's ego would have been his undoing.
He would have been disarmed very easily because he's a narcissist. And not only is he a narcissist, he's a smart ass. So he actually is at the point where he thought he was untouchable, invincible. Again, that illusion of invulnerability. No one is going to get to me.
This is rivers of gold, son.
Bring it on.
And to be encouraged by someone who he admired or liked, just at that moment, it was a weakness. And I think he would have been most surprised at the consequence of what happened there. And it was a ritualistic death.
George Freeman and Stan Smith each had a .38 caliber revolver. It was a ritualised killing. Regan was shot 8 times, one for each of the magician's kills.
The symbolism of Regan's murder was crystal clear to those around. That if you step out of line, if you do things that are barbaric, illegal's okay, barbaric is not, and you will be dealt with.
I think that criminals do have some kind of a code of ethics, and the killing of a child is, you know, truly breaking that code. They would have hated him for that.
And this one's for the kid, you fucking piece of shit.
And the fact that he was shot by leading members of the underworld, including Stan Smith and George Freeman, the body was left in the street. It was a clear signal, don't mess with us. We will come with it. We will come at you. And you will be left face down in a pool of blood.
And so it's a marvellous dramatic stage, isn't it, the way that they've set that up so that they take full power back and intimidate everybody else who might have wanted to be a Regan.
When Regans Death was announced in Long Bay Jail, there was loud cheering from the prisoners. When former detective Roger Rogerson heard Regan was dead, he headed to the morgue to see the man who'd caused so much misery laid out on a slab.
There he was lying on this slab like all dead people are who are about to have a post-mortem performed upon them, naked. And we were all amazed. He still had this smirk on his face. He had a scar on his face, I remember, and he had a smirk. Even in death, he was lying there. But as I said, whoever did it, and there's sort of conjecture as to who did it, I think they really should have all got a medal because they did something that had to be done.
He was an accident waiting to happen. He was always going to live by the sword and he was going to die by it. There was nothing surer that he was never going to make old bones.
To have built up a reputation the way he had and to have been feared and despised, you just can't believe that he only lived 29 years. He did all of that, all those evil things in 29 years. At 29, he was dead. But his legend, despite the evilness of it, the wickedness of it, his legend lives on.
Regan's murder has never been officially solved, as no one was prepared to inform against the killers of someone as odious as Regan. After a life spent inflicting pain on others, Regan's most appropriate epitaph came from George Freeman, one of his killers. He said the awful thing was he just liked hurting people. He was a sadistic killer, and what made him dangerous was that he was always in control of himself.